So if you've never sung these passages before, I mean, this particular little corner here, this is as dramatic as any little Baroque opera. And it wants to be sung like that, absolutely. But the words have to be, gosh, they just have to be sung. Okay. What do you have as a cue for your demeanor for this piece? Everybody have that? Matt, you have that? Yep. What's it?
Mean, gross, ugly.
Yeah. And you have to show it before you come in.
Bach's St. John Passion has been accused of being anti-Semitic or anti-Jewish, and this is, of course, a problem.
One of the most disturbing elements for me in this piece are the crowd scenes and the trial scenes. This sense that Jesus is on trial, that Pilate in this depiction seems to be fairly committed to the idea that he would prefer to let Jesus go, and it is the crowds of Jews who in every opportunity are condemning him.
And what you see time and time again is people saying things like, oh, but that was back then, or it's really the gospel isn't that bad. It sounds kind of bad at first, but when you read it carefully, it's actually not that bad. And I hate to say this, but that's really just wishful thinking. And there's a certain kind of spiritual sloppiness even.
It's too facile simply to say that the Gospel of John is anti-Jewish and therefore dismiss it. And at the same time, it's simplistic to say that the Gospel of John has no anti-Judaism in it whatsoever, and therefore it is a benign text that we can all celebrate.
In a post-Holocaust world, I think it's important to expose some of the venom and not try to sweep it under the rug, not try to pretend John doesn't have harsh things to say about the Jews.
What John does is forbid, in fact, his readers from blaming the Jewish leadership. To the contrary, by using the term the Jews in Greek hoi Judaioi, what John winds up doing is blaming the entire Jewish population, the Jews writ large, for the death of Jesus.
Pilatus antwortete, bin ich ein Jude, dein Volk, die hohen Priester, haben dich mir was hast du getan?
The Gospel of John is a work of art in the same way that Bach's Passion is a work of art. And art will impact hearers and viewers differently depending upon the viewer's own perceptions, own concerns that are brought into the experience of meeting that work of art.
Many people ask me, was Bach personally an anti-Semite? And I say, well, I don't really know. I would assume that most people in his day would be.
But really, when you examine the libretto, you see that what Bach is trying to say in this story is that all of mankind is responsible for the death of Christ, for the suffering in the world.
This is a place where it's exciting for modern audiences who are more sensitive to realize that Bach is actually going against his tradition.
If we just see it in the context of the 18th century and the interpretation of the death of Jesus, this is less anti-Semitic, anti-Jewish than other texts we have of the time.
Whether Bach was sympathetic or not, I'm not really all that interested in that question. I think there's a kind of institutionalized anti-Semitism that was very much a part of the world in which these pieces were written. There were people, again, he could have done worse, he could have done better. That's the way it was. But for us, the question is, how do we hear it and how do listeners hear it today?
It's very difficult for audiences today to hear this music without hearing it as being an attack on Jews.
I mean, this can be an issue, especially for Jewish members of the choir who are singing this, but we really just focused on it as a musical project, it seemed to me.
By emphasizing the message of the gospel, Bach also emphasizes some anti-Jewish aspects of these texts. For example, when the Jews sing Wir haben ein Gesetz, this very aggressive way of setting it, wir haben ein Gesetz, and also the German language with Gesetz, very hard consonants, all this adds to the very aggressive character.
Given a view where faith is a way to achieve redemption and a way to grow, these choruses show the Jews as being wrapped in the law, and they can't get out of it.
Wir haben ein Gesetz, und nach dem Gesetz soll sterben. Wir haben ein Gesetz, und nach dem Gesetz soll sterben. Ein Gesetz, und nach dem Gesetz soll sterben.
One of the things that makes this so difficult is exactly that it's so well written, that Bach makes it so powerful and so immediate that you're really drawn into these crowd scenes where the Jews are crying out for him to be crucified, crucified, crucified.
And the crowds shout and they cry and they bay. And we decided we must go for the full drama of this. We mustn't worry about any other consideration, but we should shout out the words crucify, crucify at the tops of our voices and make it as dramatic as I'm sure Bach intended.
In tune, that chord?
I think it's a piece that should be performed. I think it's a piece that should be talked about. I wouldn't change the words. I wouldn't do anything to change it. I still think it's a masterpiece, and I still cry when I hear this piece. And I've always felt that way when I hear Bach. I wouldn't be in this business if it weren't for Bach.
The Gospel of John itself I sort of see as a smoldering fire. And the question is, anyone who's commenting on it when they're writing a musical setting in Bach's day, they have, crudely speaking, they have two choices. They can either pour water on it or gasoline on it. And most composers opt to pour gasoline on it. And I think every reasonable listener nowadays will see that Bach is not pouring gasoline, but water on that story, on that problem. The reasonable people might differ, however, on whether they think the smoldering fire has been put out.
I treasure this music, but yet I want to look at what makes it so hard, and to hear the Jews say, no, no, not, to not be able to grow, to not be able to change, to be unsympathetic, to call for the release of a murderer. This is troublesome.
Pilatus aber schrieb eine Überschrift und setzte sie auf das Kreuz. und war geschrieben, Jesus von Nazareth, der Judenkönig. Da sprachen die Hohenpriester zu Pilato, schweige nicht, schweige nicht, schweige nicht,
It's interesting the way Bach uses this thematic material in the chorus Schreibe nicht der Judenkönig to undermine what took place in the aria at the beginning of the Passion, Ich folge dir gleichfalls. So we actually in this moment have sort of a denial of who Jesus is in the way that that Peter himself denied knowing Christ.
It's not just that Peter denies his Lord, but you realize that that's you singing. You realize those 2,000 Lutherans at the original rendering in 1724 and 25 also on a daily basis deny their Lord and therefore are in need of redemption. Because as I was saying before, the biggest sin of all, according to the Gospel of John, is lack of belief and confession of Jesus being the divine Messiah.
Halt, ihr angefochtenen Seelen, halt, ihr angefochtenen Seelen, halt.
The bass is singing, Eilt, eilt, hurry, hurry, rush to Golgotha, run to Golgotha. And that's the figure of rising scales that permeates the aria. And the jagged interruptions turn out to be the rest of the choir singing, where? Where do we need to go? Why? What?
In some ways, you couldn't even speak of a passion narrative in the Gospel of John. It's just an account of the glorification of the Son of God.
For the Gospel of John, Jesus is more or less stoic. He goes through the Passion because this is what has to happen, and he directs the scenes himself.
In the Synoptic Gospels, Simon of Cyrene is impressed into carrying Jesus' cross. The Gospel of John makes a point of saying he carried his own cross. And there you get this glimpse into an author who doesn't like the idea of his hero being weak and needing assistance in the end.
One aspect of extreme interest also in the Passion narratives is the question of violence. And that's really, of course, been brought home by the Gibson movie, which focuses almost exclusively on that. There's really not much interest in the issue of violence in the Gospel of John, as I understand it, and Bach doesn't pick up on that. What they're more interested in is who Jesus is and what he can do for humanity, and any kind of lurid dwelling on blood and guts and so on is seen to be very much beside the point.
The image of Mary at the foot of the cross is a powerful tool when working with students. Her son on the cross, you can sense what Maria must be going through in that moment.
That's when Jesus says, "Woman, behold thy son, son, behold thy mother." And this is very touching.
Jesus is saying, we need a new form of family relations. We need a new type of family values, one that's not driven by marriage or biology, but one that's driven by loyalty.
Da nun Jesus seine Mutter sah und der Jünger dabei steht, den lieb hatte, spricht zu seiner
Jesus doesn't just die because his body has given way. It's when he recognizes that all has been accomplished that he says, it is finished.
Everything leads to the aria, es ist vollbracht. It is done. So the focus is eventually on Jesus Christ and on what he did for us as believers, for our salvation.
Bach takes this motif, as he has done in other arias, to transition from recitative into the aria, and gives it to the viola da gamba. And the viola da gamba has a very plaintive sort of sound. I think it's often used to represent the wood or the cross. The countertenor, or the alto, in our case it was a countertenor, Eden Howell, takes over this theme and comments on the sadness.
Es ist vollbracht comes at a very pivotal moment in the Passion story. It is, in my mind, it is a frozen slice of time between the moment when Jesus draws in his last breath on the cross and when he exhales it and dies. This aria is a juxtaposition of two musical styles, and it's a juxtaposition of two statements of human emotion, two different takes perhaps on what Jesus' death means. So you have an A section, a slower section. You have a B section that is very fast and triumphant. And then you have a small recapitulation to the material from the A section.
One particularly beautiful moment in the piece is when he sings Die Trauernacht, the night of mourning or of sadness. And the countertenor in this case goes way down low into his range and sings a sustained C, Die Trauernacht, this night of waiting and of anticipation for what is to come. Bach then goes there and shows us what is to come in a brief moment of excitement and victory.
And the perspective of humanity is the hero of Judah, Jesus, has won the battle, and he has closed this final struggle for all of us.
Instead of trumpets, because they weren't allowed to use trumpets in the church before Easter, he uses strings, but it's very obviously a trumpet sort of motive. Da-da-da-da-da-da-da, and you hear this wonderful trill and this flourish. You see the angels rising up and the resurrection. For a brief moment, we have the resurrection.
Der Held aus Juda singt mit Macht. Der Held aus Juda singt mit Macht. Der Held aus Juda singt mit Macht. Und schließt den Kampf, und schließt den Kampf, und schließt den Kampf. Der Held aus Juda singt mit Macht.
In that triumphant moment, humanity is becoming aware of this. Humanity is saying, this is good, this is amazing that Jesus has done this for us. And then it falters. And you return to the slower section with just the statement of the opening line, Es ist vollbracht, it is finished, with a gap of silence between the end of the fast section and the beginning of the next slow section. I mean, to my mind as a performer, the way I chose to interpret it, that's a crucial moment of silence, because it's humanity screaming out all of this glory that Jesus' death means, and then you're left in this void because, oh my God, we're alone. You know, he has left this world.
Singt mit Macht, der Held aus Jodel singt mit Macht, der Held aus Jodel singt mit Macht, und schließt den Kampf, und schließt den Kampf, und schließt den Kampf. Der Held aus Jodel singt mit Macht, der Held aus Jodel singt mit Macht, und schließt den Kampf, und schließt den Kampf. Es ist
At the point of the crucifixion, Matthew, Mark, and Luke all refer to the veil being split. Only Matthew goes on to talk about other supernatural phenomenon, like the graves of saints being opened. John has none of those signs, and so it's interesting that Bach chose to put that much emphasis on something that was not part of the Johannine Gospel.
This is a place that Bach is very focused on sin and the response of the listener to the fact that he or she is sinful and needs to be saved by Jesus in his sacrificial death.
Der Vorhang reißt, der Fenster fällt, die Erde bebt, die Gräber spalten, weil sie den Schöpfer erkannten. Was willst du deines Wortes
The very last aria Bach uses in the St. John Passion, Zerfließe mein Herze, dissolve my heart, gives again kind of a summary of that, how the individual reacts on the death of Jesus Christ.
It is a very striking aria, unusual sort of orchestration. You have the low basso continuo that kind of adds the foundation or the ground for this piece. And then above this, in order to depict sort of this floating, ethereal quality, Bach sets very high instruments, the flutes and the soprano, on top of all of this. The soprano then enters with the text, Zerfließe mein Herze, and this means that my heart should melt away in floods of tears. These kind of images are very typical in Baroque writing.
Perhaps the same soprano that wanted to follow Jesus and perhaps didn't succeed. And at this moment, she is aware that the crucifixion has happened, and she is wallowing in tears. She's allowing herself to cry.
He uses a figure, da-da-dum, 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 where you kind of feel this stopping and starting. In German, they might say schluchzen, this sort of Zerfließe mein Herz. It becomes very intimate and very personal. The soprano is singing in the stratosphere the entire time, and it really is an otherworldly sort of experience.
this sense of stretching into the upper part of her range in a kind of anguish, ya-da-da, ya-da-da-da, as if she's just barely holding in the tears and crying and then releasing them down. And it's such an extraordinary moment where Bach is able to capture not only what tears sound like, but what they feel like.
Behind the suffering, we see kind of a hope. This is only a glimpse of a hope, but this hope is present in the text and also in the music. It is not entirely dark music. It's rather like a sad love aria.
Another very interesting aspect of the aria is an ornament at the end of the aria when Bach just simply writes above the word tot a squiggly line. In our performance, Mellissa Hughes chooses to do a beautiful, very uneven sort of ornament. It's almost like her heart is stopping in that moment.
This is the moment where I cry listening to the piece, and yet perhaps a moment where the full spiritual fulfillment isn't there, because she is not embracing entirely what the benefits, what the results of this event will be for her spiritually as a believer, but is enjoying in some sense, and I use that word on purpose, enjoying the physicality of the crying.
The final recit is very soft and quiet, and it talks about how they get Jesus in the grave. And it kind of ties everything down, so it really has a sense of hushed kind of respect for the dead.
Bach ends this piece with so many different layers in 3 different ways. He first of all has kind of a lullaby. Ruhet wohl, be in peace, you holy bones. A reflection of what's going on in the Passion narrative. Then we have a reflection from the perspective of the congregation in the setting of the German Agnus Dei, Lamb of God. And then finally we have a reflection that puts the entire piece in a larger historical context. After the performance of the Passion, the motet by Jakob Handel is performed.
The three-part ending to this particular version of the St. John Passion is very demanding for the singers, because you need different parts of your technique after such a long performance, and you have to sing in different ways the three different choruses. They require totally different ways of singing.
So by the end, we are exhausted, and we are sleepy, and we are wanting things to resolve themselves. And it's not a moment of, okay, let's go home, or boredom. It's like your intensity level has reached about as far as you can take it. And it's a pretty emotional moment once you find that the beginning of the end.
The penultimate chorus, I think, is a kind of narcotic. It calms you, it soothes you. It's a way of saying, yes, all of this ugly thing happened, but there's rest. And that there's comfort. And I think for me, as a listener now, I do feel that as an absolute moment of comfort.
A second choral movement follows that talks about the sins of man. We have the text of the German Agnus Dei, the text that is used during the Eucharist. So Bach puts the entire Passion in a much larger theological and liturgical context. He gives a glimpse on the liturgy, on every Sunday.
To the degree that Bach emphasizes our culpability for Jesus' death, that it's because of our sins Jesus has to die, I think he probably goes a bit beyond the Gospel of John or the other Gospels, but I would say he does so in a salutary way, that it's theologically insightful and it's a more ethical way of interpreting these texts.
In Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the Eucharist, the communion meal, is established at the Last Supper.
In the Gospel of John, that's not the case. Their meal is not a Passover meal. In John's artistic universe, the way he connects Jesus' death with Passover is by having Jesus himself killed as the lambs are slaughtered for the Passover.
So Jesus becomes, in effect, the paschal offering. And just as the blood of the lamb prevented the angel of death from killing those ancient Hebrews in Egypt, so the blood of Jesus symbolically becomes the mechanism by which sin is removed, death is overcome, and humanity and divinity are fully united.
you've forgotten that you are performing for a crowd that wants to hear beautiful music, because you are singing the story, and it is not it's not a simple story. It's not short and easy to sing and easy to grasp. There's something special about when the end came and you realized that everyone in the room just went through this experience together, and it was no longer a performance. It was a joint experience